Thank you all very much. Thank you very much. The American political culture of this country is on the cusp of becoming a corpse, right? But it's not too late. We can save this patient, but we can't do so if we don't reinvest in our public libraries. We can't do so without the assistance of our libraries. Furthermore, though, I'd like to argue that our libraries cannot help resurrect this American democracy if they don't adopt some of the best practices that have emerged from the global anarchist community over the last several decades. So let me put that statement in context just a bit. You're all familiar with the traditional stereotype of the public library from a century ago or so, right? They're these cathedral-like spaces, cavernous, that are to be revered in silence, right? And they are full of rows of dusty books, right? And the individuals who are in the library are consumed within themselves. They're not interacting, they're not talking, you have to be silent, right? So libraries did tend to be like this a century ago, we know this, but libraries have been moving in profoundly more interesting directions, as many of you know, in the last few decades, thank goodness. Whereas libraries did tend to be these book warehouses for readers only, they were solitary and so on, they are increasingly multi-use, multimedia spaces where the citizen is not merely a consumer of information, but a producer. The kids and adults, people go there and they do stuff and make stuff, right? Libraries are no longer silent. They're designed to be loud, interactive spaces with children's and adult programming every day where people are allowed to collaborate with one another. In fact, that collaboration, that civic engagement is encouraged. So I think the degree to which communities not merely tolerate such an evolution on behalf of libraries, but enable that evolution, they do our democracy a service. As you know, if information is the currency of democracy, as Mr. Jefferson suggests, it's true that libraries are democracy's banks and trusts, right? Where this information is aggregated, it makes more of itself in some magical way with interest, and then it distributes that information out to the communities. It shares it with everybody, right? But unfortunately, in the 21st century, democracy is it's under assault because public spaces, that is the public library, these public spaces are eroding and going away in a number of ways, and the public sphere is shrinking as well, and that's problematic. So what do I mean when I say public sphere? The public sphere is not so much a space as an assemblage of relationships and objects and people and I guess technologies and media and so on that interact and swirl, as you see on the screen there, in a variety of ways. It includes this public sphere, yes, newspapers and magazines and cable television, reporters and policymakers, but also citizens, the library, the street, the cafe, the pub, social media, of course, the internet in a variety of ways, popular culture. Right? This is all public sphere. So this public sphere allows groups and individuals to interact in the public, or several publics, plural, to help discuss political issues of common interest, to help influence public opinion, of course, and perhaps initiate political action. Now, this public sphere emerged in the 17th century alongside both capitalism and democracy, but it reached an apex in the 19th century or so, but it's been in decline ever since for a variety of reasons. We've seen the privatization of public space in problematic ways. We have seen advertising reaching formerly non-commercial spaces, right? We have, of course, city buses and bus stops that are advertisements. We have public buildings that are advertisements with branding on them and so on. And of course, even public schools and libraries have ads on and in them in ways that we didn't used to have, right? So media concentration too has been problematic in a variety of ways, whereas in the 1980s, you had some 90% of media across platforms owned and controlled by, say, 50 or so corporations in this country. In the 21st century, media, 90% of American media is owned, managed by a handful of companies, right? Again, across platforms, whether it's newspapers, book publishing, talk radio, record labels, internet service providing, cable television, and so on. Furthermore, the result is then we have what you might see an explosion of media sources, right? Internet websites, cable TV channels, but as a result we have fewer common sources of news and information where people are increasingly talking at cross paths, right? They're not on the same level, resulting in this fracturing or fragmentation of the public, singular, into several competing publics, plural, right? And I don't have to describe for you this growing gap between the rich and poor. That's obvious to everyone at this point. That shrinking of the middle class has problematic consequences for democracy, right? So now we should not be surprised that if democracy requires public sphere, it's not a surprise to you that when the public sphere shrinks, we're seeing trust in government decline, right? You can see the Pew Research Center's graph here, which shows on the darker line that from the 1960s to the 21st century, trust in government generally has declined precipitously. I'd argue this is not a result of any particular political candidate or corruption in Washington so much as it is a reflection on the ways in which the public is just less interested in democracy as an idea, right, as the public sphere has shrunk. They're not interested in governance as a concept in the same ways we were decades ago, right? And so this is where public libraries can reemerge to help breathe new life into that public sphere, to resurrect the non-commercial commons, if you will, right? And so libraries can't do this, though, by remaining those dusty places where the shelves are stacked closely together and there's a few tables and so on. Libraries need to become those open access, multimedia, multi-use spaces that are flexible and accessible to everybody and geared toward interactivity, collaboration, co-working, and so on. And many libraries are moving in this direction, thank goodness. But what I want to argue, too, is that so far as libraries are going in this direction, they're doing so in the wake of a group of folks who were doing it long before them in many cases. And these are these folks, right? The anarchists, the punk rockers, the DIY underground community, and so on. These folks, for decades, in many cases before public libraries, were trying to provide information and culture and texts to the community at a low-cost, no-cost way, right? And we perhaps shouldn't be surprised by this because anarchism as an idea actually has a deep literary history, right? The 19th century philosophers of anarchism notwithstanding, there have for centuries been poets who self-identify as anarchist playwrights and writers of fiction. We see in the 21st century peer-reviewed academic journals dedicated to anarchism, just as we see websites and magazines. There are anarchist publishing houses, bookstores, book fairs, and so on. And some of the notable names you can see on the screen there of anarchism who've been very prolific over the last century alone, right? And so, what has emerged then in the late, I suppose, or the 1980s, maybe even the late 1970s and early 1980s, is what the anarchist community calls the InfoShop, right? This community collective, this information center, as it were, which does a variety of services depending on where you live, from offering a browsing library to literature for purchase, to meeting space for group study space for students, right? Space for lectures and debates. There's performance space for bands, and so on. Art gallery space for artists, and production space for artists, and so on, and of course courses. So this is really interesting, and this is a good development, and this has been happening for a long time. This image is from, the image you saw, is from an InfoShop known as The Burrow in Winona, Minnesota, which has unfortunately closed its doors. But for, I guess, a little more context, consider an InfoShop that remains open. Blue Stockings in New York City. This is an InfoShop where if you see the space there on the screen, it's 1,000 or 2,000 square feet with some space off camera to the right there. And just a quick gander at the Blue Stockings website will show you that all of this stuff is happening just this month in that space. Again, from a series of classes to discussions, open discussions on mental health in America, and so on, open mic nights for poets or politicians, author readings, lectures from academics and others, film screenings, book clubs, and so on. All this stuff is happening in a variety of info shops around the country. Or if you're an info shop that's less interested in community education and events and courses, etc., a lot of info shops go in the more arts and culture direction, as this image suggests. So many info shops provide darkroom space for photographers who don't have a digital camera, right? Art space, both, again, production space, paint, silk screening materials, and so on, and gallery space for those artists. Also computer labs, again, performance space for live musicians or theater troupes, and so on. Now, what would we call these spaces if they did not rely often on all volunteer labor and they were not, I suppose, restricted to 1,000 or 2,000 square feet is all? We would call these spaces public libraries, wouldn't we? In most communities, at least. And now these info shops, for a variety of reasons, they have difficulty staying open. Their operations are not as sustainable as I think they would even like them to be. And there's a few reasons for this. Primarily, though, the ways in which the market itself has been very hard on the public sphere. This market has been incredibly hard on InfoShops as well. And I would argue that this closure of these spaces like the borough is not a commentary on anarchism as a philosophy or anarchists' organizational skill or lack thereof, so much as it is a commentary on the difficulty anyone has, any project has, in trying to seriously undertake nonprofit work and provide arts, education, culture, and text to the community in a low-cost, no-cost way. Capitalism just doesn't accept that. It's not excited about that idea whatsoever. And this is the reason that the private bookstores and booksellers, other private ventures, tend not to do this. Not entirely, they just tend not to. So if the private market's typically not doing this, and if the InfoShops are having difficulty doing so, where does that leave us? That leaves us with the library, right? Libraries need to become more like InfoShops. We need librarians to become more like anarchists. We need our libraries to appropriate the idea of the InfoShop and to expand it, to make it more robust and sustainable and spread it to more people in more communities. After all, the InfoShop is already being appropriated by a number of moneyed interests. Interestingly enough, here you see the World Bank's InfoShop bookstore in, in Washington, D.C., which provides, as the text suggests, World Bank Group publications, plus thousands of other books, plus gifts and souvenirs. Right? So, what an interesting commentary, ironic though it may be, and perhaps not unpredictable, that the very folks who in many ways are responsible for the shrinking of the public sphere, for the erosion of public space, that being the World Bank, World Trade Organization, and so on, are the very ones who have now appropriated the InfoShop idea at the same time as they press down the faces into the cement of the folks who invented that idea and are gearing the InfoShop's effects more toward markets, capitalization, privatization, and so on. So this is all to say that the InfoShop, in fact, is an exceptional idea worth spreading. Exceptional idea, and we need our public libraries to be more like InfoShops. We need our librarians to be more like anarchists, right? And so far as public libraries in the communities that they serve are unable to do this, they reinforce the status quo, unfortunately, and they miss a tremendous opportunity to breathe new life into the public sphere and to really help sustain this democracy. Thank you.